Hello, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to the 68th edition of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Today, Jim is going to take us through the update of the market and with particular focus on Cote d'Ivoire, among others. We also will like the opportunity now to in English, but there is simultaneous translation. So please select the language of your choice and to hear the translation. Let me mention that we are being supported by a number of organizations who have made this possible. And among them, the European Union, Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. We also have the GIZ.com Cashew Move project, the USAID Cashew Info, and the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, not forgetting the Cashew Club. Jim Fitzpatrick, my internet has been a bit unstable, so I wouldn't like to take much time except to say that don't forget all routes lead to Benin from the 17th to 19th of September, and the 20th of September will then be for a full visit to the GDIZ Industrial Zone. So you are welcome to be with us in September in Benin. And hi, Jim, how are you doing?
Good morning, Ernest. All good, and you?
Good morning. Yeah, I'm fine here, except with some internet challenges. But I think once your end is good, we are happy for that.
Well, let's
But
hope
Jim,
it stays stale. Yeah.
exactly. But Jim, I'm happy you would talk about Cote d'Ivoire in this session because it's been 10 years since the reform started. And it is interesting to see how much impact the reform in La Cote d'Ivoire has had, starting with about 560,000 metric tons in 2014. Today, they are almost twice or even surpassing that figure. So it's good to have some discussion on Cote d'Ivoire. And at this stage, I would like to hand over to you to take it from there.
Thanks, Ernest. Hello, everyone. You're very welcome once again to our Global Market Encounter with Jim. We're going to talk about market prices and trade, as we always do. And we'll have a look also at a kind of a midterm review of the harvest. We're more than 50% through the current crop in terms of its harvest. Let's have a look and see the impact in the major countries. And we'll ask a question I think that many people are asking at the moment. Following the rise in market prices, can these prices be maintained? Let me invite everyone to ask questions or give some comments. You can raise your hand and come online and chat, or you can just type into the Q&A, and I'm more than happy to talk about your questions. We get some great questions on this webinar. Keep them coming. Let me remind you, as Ernesto has already done, and no doubt will again, about the ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. It's in Cotonou in Benin, starting on the 17th of September. Well worth attending. Interesting theme this year, building capacities for a sustainable African cashew industry. Should be good, should be fun. Hope to see you there. Let's talk about markets. Let's talk about prices and trade. So what I'll do is I'll talk about prices and trade. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the harvest. And then we look at that question. Can these current prices be maintained? Of course, that question seems to suggest that they won't go up, but we can't rule that out either. So let's have a look. And let's have a look at some of the key indicators in the market, as we usually do, starting at the farm gate. So we're now really talking about farm gate in West Africa, those countries continuing to harvest, and to a certain extent in India. And what we're seeing is farm gate prices are steady, maybe even strong in some countries. But in most countries in West Africa, quality has been lower this year. That's not so much the case, of course, in Guinea-Bissau or in Senegal or in the Gambia. Those high quality areas still seem to have maintained their quality this year. Generally speaking, arrivals are easing. It does look like a lower crop than last year, but to me, when I add it all up, it's somewhere between 7 and 15%. It's not these 25%. I even saw one figure of 40%. That's just not the nature of cashews. So there's a lot of rumors, and let's try and get to the bottom of some of them. Looking at the international RCN situation, key factor is there are more physical arrivals. So product that was shipped is beginning to arrive into Vietnam especially, but also into India. There are more shipments. Prices remain quite steady, probably too steady, but nonetheless, they haven't really reacted yet to some of the other events in the market. There are a lot of contract defaults, which spreads uncertainty, and a lot of renegotiation, which is contract default by another name. If we look at the kernels market, so we saw this remarkable rise in prices, but that has now come off the high levels. There were some, we saw bids at $3.45 for 320s, we saw offers at $3.60, but it's way off those prices now. There has been a little bit of a correction from the extremes of early last week. There is certainly a lot of conversation around delays, again, default of contracts. So I call it delay, default, and denial. So the delay is the delay in shipments, which is the first signal of a default usually. And a lot of buyers would be in denial, and they'd be thinking that their suppliers will honor the contracts, and many won't. But many will, and those are the ones that will be with us in 5 years and 10 years. Downstream on kernels, we are definitely seeing some markets cooling, probably on higher prices. China is an example. It could be seasonal, it could be a reaction to the higher prices. Buyers have naturally enough become reluctant. The initial reaction to rising prices was to take a look, make sure the cover was in place, but now buyers have become a little bit more reluctant. And of course, all these delays, the uncertainty is having an impact on decision making. So this is often a time of year when decisions are made on promotions in those countries where promotions are important in the second half of the year. And it's often the time when the final cover is taken for the second half of the year in those markets that buy forward. Obviously, there's going to be a huge rethink on promotions and a huge rethink on the level of cover that will be needed, but more about that later. Let's have a look at some of the major influences on the market over the past 2 weeks. And I'm going to start with the rather controversial topic of export bans. Ernest mentioned 10 years of the new interventionist style of policy in Cote d'Ivoire, and intervention has become more and more common. The export ban is just one example. So the ban has been lifted on warehouse stocks. This has been done in a most unclear manner. It's not clear whether the full ban is lifted or not. As far as I know, there's no official announcement. Business does not like uncertainty. There's a lot of difficult factors around this export ban, but one of them is in the lifting of it, the uncertainty caused by when, if, is bad for business, especially in the current volatile environment. The other aspect of it is, of course, the ban was put in place to facilitate certain processors to secure raw material. Has their situation changed since the ban was instigated? Have they become more financially able to pay for raw cashew nuts?
Shift.
And are they, Ernest, you'd be a good idea if you muted yourself. The lifting of the ban is unclear, and business doesn't like uncertainty. So if we look at it, we have to ask, has the situation for those processors that it was intended to help, has that changed since the ban was started way back on May 7th? It's a big question. In Benin, the ban continues, but again, this situation of difficulty of implementation, the ban in export continues, but so do the exports. And if we look at shipments, even if we look at the way RCN is quoted from some countries, it's very clear that a lot of product has moved across the border into neighboring countries. Second big factor over the last couple of weeks has been defaults of contract. Renegotiation of contracts obviously increased processor costs. Now, processors in many cases have made forward sales, particularly those supplying Western markets from Vietnam. And this puts them in acute difficulty. They start every season short because they must sell forward. That's the way the market works. They then need to cover that in. They buy it, they take a chance, but they buy it. If they get defaults, it really causes their organization and their costing to spiral out of control. Therefore, some default of kernel contracts, and by default I mean those that will never be shipped. There'll be a lot of delays, but some default is inevitable. Some of these low price contracts, I mean, if you consider it, there are contracts today with a $40,000 difference from the sale price to the contract price on a container. Pretty unlikely to be shipped as is. So some will negotiate when they're in difficulty and buyers would do well to support them. Others will walk away. It's going to cause a bigger and bigger problem as the year goes on. Of course, it's not the first time. I came into this business in the early 1980s. It was a big problem then. It's a big problem now. Looking at production, so what's become clear in the last couple of weeks is that Cambodia's crop is a lot better than expected. In West Africa, the volume concerns are easing because we're seeing more and more product arriving, but the quality concerns in certain countries, as I mentioned, continue to grow. Côte d'Ivoire is the primary example of this, where the quality of the raw material in country is lower and lower. From India, interesting picture. It's a bit mixed, different parts of the country telling me different things. Amish Pai, the last time we spoke together on this event, Amit told us that he wasn't as optimistic as he had been earlier in the year, and he too was seeing different information from different parts of the country. So that's interesting, and I'll give you a little recap on that as we go on. Fourth factor is on demand, and although demand this year has been pretty good, we are beginning to see the first reactions to higher prices. Whether that continues or not, well, that's a question we'll try and answer in the course of the morning. So let's have a look at prices and let's have a look at the price reaction. So prices, as you know by now, spiked up. I think I marked 360 as the top, and I'd call 330 was readily available Monday morning. That puts us back around about the levels we were back in 2021. Now, at that time, we had very strong demand during COVID, and there were continued supply fears due to the impact of COVID in a whole range of countries, including India, including Vietnam, and most of West Africa. So we saw a real spike in prices then. As those supply fears disappeared, the market fell really from August, and there was heavy selling in Vietnam from August. Questionable selling, to be quite frank. I mean, why did Vietnamese processors enter the market so aggressively at that period remains to be seen. But they did, and the market price fell sharply, and that's we got that, and that was the beginning fall, which led to 14-year lows and then a period of very low prices. Today, we're looking at a situation where we have, again, still strong demand up to now and supply fears, but this time due to concerns on the crop. So although this spike is much more dramatic than back in 2021, there are a lot of similarities. I mean, the main reason for the extent of the spike was the fact that prices were so low coming into this season. If you go back to 2021, prices were much closer to the average price of the period. So let's have a look at some of these 320 prices. Here you've got a chart that shows WW320's FOB from the lowest price origin, which has almost always been Vietnam throughout the period, from June 2021 through to this week. And we just a few observations on this. So let's go back a little bit and let's look at what happened in 2022. We saw a price rise and a fallback. So at time we saw demand easing on economic concerns, primarily in Western markets, but they did impact almost everywhere. So we had this post-COVID boom in demand during 2021, followed by a strong first half of 2022. And in February, the Russians attacked Ukraine. Uncertainty in economies, inflation started to kick in, and we saw prices then fall away. In fact, for 2 years in a row, we saw at the second half of the year fall in prices. So in two cases, in 2021, driven up by strong demand, the demand faded away and prices drifted. 2022, a recovery during the season, and then it slipped away, but on economic concerns. So this is post-COVID, I think. This is economies, especially in the West. So 2 years in a row, lower prices in the second half. That is unusual. For many, many years, if you look at the price curve, you'll see that the second half of the year generally has higher prices. But recently that's been reversed for the reasons I've mentioned. Then we come to 2023, and we've been through a period of relatively stable prices. We come into 2023, and again, we see the market slip away. Demand was strong, but the market hit 14-year lows. And during that period, we can say, I think, prices were too low. I mean, now we can certainly say prices were too low, but even at the time we were saying that $2.40, $2.50, this just really doesn't make sense. It doesn't match with any of the other factors in the market. Now, why it got so low, there could be many answers to that, but I mean, there's different theories. People will tell you it was because processors in Vietnam wanted to get RCN prices down. Others would say it was a panic response to surplus in the market. It certainly wasn't demand, because demand was very strong. Demand was strong before low prices. So strong demand has been partially, yes, a response to lower prices, but it was strong before low prices kicked in. So looking at that situation, we were at a period where we had short sales at low prices. So as a processor, you're looking at a situation where you have short sales at low prices and your supply chain is far away. I mean by that, West Africa. About 50% of the nuts processed in Vietnam, for example. Expectations of a crop problem coming into the year. People were talking about El Nino, and they were talking about that there might be some difficulties with the crop. Then we get a late crop in West Africa and an unclear situation in Cambodia. I'll come back to that. Rumor, and there are always rumors in cashews, but they're not always treated as fact. At this time they were, and this is the root of some of the kind of panic-stricken reactions that we saw, and some of the language that we saw used in reporting the market, to which we've discussed over the last few webinars too. Farmers were encouraged to hold. Prices were rising. They had sold something. Problem when farmers hold is, especially in West Africa, quality tends to go down. Governments intervened. We saw Cote d'Ivoire, we've mentioned, Benin, we've mentioned, Guinea-Bissau was another one we talked about the last time. And some of these interventions had unintended results. I don't think that they were intended to increase the value of RCN. I think they were intended for the purpose stated, for example, to protect processors, but that's not the impact that they had. Then we get a price spiral. We get the price spiral now is confirming the rumors which led to the price spiral, and you get this kind of vicious circle effect. and then you get the contract defaults. And that's pretty much where we are right now. The market spiked up, it's corrected a little bit because it had always gone too high, just as it always went too low. And now we get these contract defaults. Where do we go next? Well, that's a really difficult one. I'm going to try and answer it in a few minutes. But before we do that, let's have a look at RCN pricing. So raw cash nut prices have moved up. They haven't backtracked in the way that kernels prices have, up to Monday at least, when I last had a good look at it. We are at prices that are back. So if you recall, we do this index. The dotted red line is the index. You can see all the trends from different countries, forementioned on this, and then we do a kind of an index. So the index takes into account the quality across the different countries and it weights the volume. So the index is a rough estimate of the trend. So that's why the dotted red line, the index, is below the top prices. And the index is about the same place it was on exactly the same point of 2022, and a little bit lower than where it was in 2021. So it begins to look more and more that this period, most of 2023, is the anomaly, and that this period is the unusual period rather than these higher prices being unsustainable. We're going to come back to that. Before we do that, let's have a look at production, and let's have a look at specific countries. I'm going to look at Cambodia, I'm going to look at Cote d'Ivoire, and I'm going to look at India. So we're looking at 1, 2, and 3 in terms of the volume produced, and then we'll have our usual short survey across West Africa to try and post you on some of the developments in the region. So we'll start by having a look at Cambodia. Now, at this time of year, the best way to get some kind of clear indication is to look at trade, because we know the trade figures are well recorded. They weren't always, of course. There was the 2021 situation, but we're going to leave that to one side, and we'll have a look at 2022, 2023, and 2024. So far in 2024, if you look at the monthly imports to Vietnam from Cambodia, you get this figure, 773,946 tons. The total figure from Vinacas is 759,000 tons. There is a small difference between the two figures. Either way, it's a big number, because if we look at January to May of last year, it was 544,000 tons, and January to May of 2022, it was 620,000 tons. So in any case, whichever number you use for the current January to May period, either 773 or 759, Vietnam has recorded more imports from Cambodia in 5 months than it did in the full year of 2022, and way ahead of the full year 2023. Now, if we just simply extrapolate from that what the Cambodian crop might be, given that high percentage of the imports are in the first 5 months of the year, that would suggest that the Cambodian crop could be, and there's a big question mark on this, so just be careful how you use the number, it could be as much as 880,000 tons, which goes a long way to make up deficits experienced elsewhere. So let's have a little closer look at that. And I'm asking, could this be the second largest crop in history? So here are the production figures based on Cambodian production in each of the years. 2021, I put a big question mark there, 1.1 million tons. We're not really sure if that figure is correct. Subsequent years, we're pretty sure, 725, 700, and I'm asking this year, is it 880,000 tons based on trade so far at 773? And it could well be. Now we know, and we know this from good sources in Cambodia, from CCF to mention just one, that there are more trees maturing this year on more hectares, and that this is compensating somewhat for the lower yields. That has potentially a huge impact in the future. But so far, if we look at this, it would seem that that compensation is very big, and maybe that the lower yields are not as low as might have been expected earlier on in the season. In fact, some people are saying that there are more dried cashews held back in Cambodia this year, simply because they're being dried. So if you dry them, you can store them. If they're wet, well, you better not store wet cashews, as everyone knows. So it does look to me as if the Cambodian crop is looking very healthy this year. It could, of course, be that everything has already been exported, but that would go against the trends of all of the previous years. So safe to say, I think that the crop is somewhere between 760,000 tons, i.e. the lowest figure for imports to Vietnam so far, and this 880,000 tons, which would be a calculated figure. It's a good crop, that's the fact. And the big question, of course, now that we start to look forward into 2025, could there actually be a 1 million ton crop in 2025 in Cambodia? And it seems possible. If the lower yielding trees that were impacted by the weather this year give good, strong average yields next year, and those new maturing trees continue to develop, it seems quite likely that we could see a really strong production year in 2025, given the right weather circumstances and other events. Plus, strong prices this year, in the midst of a good crop, will encourage production in Cambodia, will encourage farmers to look after their trees better, and will encourage more people to plant more cashews in Cambodia. Secondly, let's have a look at the Ivorian situation. What is going on in Côte d'Ivoire in the cashews? So we're going to look at this situation as of the 31st of May. Now, some of these figures are fact, and some of them are calculated by us. I'm going to tell you which is which as we go. So we know total imports by India to the end of April and Vietnam to the end of May, 116,000 tons. We understand that another 280,000 tons was shipped, and that's either imported into India in May, imported into Vietnam in June, or afloat at the moment on its way. We're guessing, and I think I'm being conservative in this number. I was in Ghana last week. It's really interesting what's happening in Ghana on cashews. It's developing really well. I saw raw cashew nuts around the border areas that were certainly from Côte d'Ivoire. So I'm estimating that the land border trade is about 50,000 tons. Now that's 50,000 tons, does not include what might have already been shipped and imported into Vietnam and India by the end of April or May. I think local exporters had about 165,000 tons in stock. That's before their sales to the processors. Local buyers and assemblers were guessing around about 50,000 tons. I'm open to correction on that figure because I can't go around and count them all, but that's I think is a rough estimate. That'll be a very, very small proportion of the crop, remember, although it seems like a big number. Talking to processors, we think about 285,000 tons has been procured. This is before the sales from exporters to the national processors. That would mean, by our calculation, about 900,000 tons commercialized by the end of May. I think CCI's figure for that is 945, and they're probably right, but that's the calculation as it comes out for us. The CCI official crop estimate is 1 million tons, but we think it's not realistic to say that less than 10% of the crop would be commercialized after the end of May. So we think the crop is, in terms of volume, a minimum 1.1 million tons. Now we'd see, because we just think it's not realistic if CCI is correct that 945,000 tonnes has been commercialised, it doesn't seem correct that it just would add a further 55,000 tonnes in the course of June and July. And the harvest does go on in certain areas of the country well into July, well into August in some areas. And of course, some of the product is held back. So extrapolating from the figures, we're saying a crop 1.1 million, and I wouldn't be surprised if it were higher than that in volume. Big issue is quality, of course. What does this mean? So we have another look now, and we'll have a look taking into account. So now we're taking into account a carry-in, about 45,000 tonnes, imported in destination, shipped, not imported. So shipped, not imported includes the land border trade. There's no record of it as an import in Vietnam or in India, but it has left Côte d'Ivoire, and that's where we get the 330. We're saying that the exporters sell 30,000 tonnes of their stock to processors. That would leave them 135,000 tonnes. Of course, some of this is on the water. This is 31st of May, don't forget. Now, if that's true, and I'm not sure that those processors actually have the capacity to buy that 30,000 tonnes, but let's take it as a fact. That would leave about 250,000 tonnes to be commercialised, and it would give a total export availability for 2024 of 830,000 tonnes, made up of what's been imported, what's been shipped, what's been crossed the land border, what's with exporters, and what's still to come in based on a crop of 1.1 million tonnes. How does that compare to other years? Well, let's have a look. So we've got the blue bars, official exports from Côte d'Ivoire annually. Our estimate of the cross-border trade, again, it's probably a conservative estimate, but that's fine. Total availability for export is this one. That's the key number. So here you see in 2020, 720,000 tonnes was the total availability. Fast forward to 2024, as I've said by our calculation, that's 830,000 tonnes. That's down from last year's figure by about 11%. But it's about the same number as 2022. So there's a little bit of a strange situation here. We've got this massive response on price to a disruption in the RCN market, or the apparent shortage of RCN. But when we look at the actual availability, it's not that much different. There is one slightly complicating factor. Let's take into account some of the quality issues. And we know for a fact that quality is lower in 2024. So if we take the 930,000 tonnes of 2023, and let's say it was on average 47 pounds, that would give you 211,000 tonnes of kernels. If you take the 830,000 tonnes, and let's say on average, it's 45 pounds. That's a guesstimate. Right? It could be 46. It's unlikely to be 44. Some of the earlier material was a little bit better. So that would give 179,000 tonnes. So if you take this difference in availability, 929 to 830, and you add in a factor, about 4%, for the loss in outturn yield, in terms of kernels, that would give you about 15% loss. In terms of raw cashew nut availability for export and for processing in India and in Vietnam. There will also be increased processing in Côte d'Ivoire this year. We think that already the figure procured is over 300,000 tonnes. Last year's processing was about 265,000 tonnes. If we were right with our figure of 315,000 tonnes, that will be a significant increase in processing in the country this year. And of course, that is one of the reasons why this availability is restricted. So some of this is lower production, and some of it is, of course, more material processed in the country this year. So there is a lower quality, there is a significant difference, about 15% loss between the quality and the volume for export, but not necessarily 15% in total, because some of the raw cashews that are not being shipped are being processed in the country. So perhaps this year we will get a figure. Last year, 21% of the crop was processed. This year we could get a figure approaching 25% of the crop, maybe a little less, which is progress, even in a difficult season. That's Côte d'Ivoire. Let's have a look at India. Now, this is what we're hearing, and there's not much official information coming my way, at least, but I have been talking to quite a few people in India about what they're seeing. So here you have, well, this is India, as I'm sure you know, and then we have different states producing different percentages of the crop. People will sometimes discuss these percentages, but let's just take it as a rough guideline for the time being. What we hear from the eastern areas, we hear from Andhra, we hear from Orissa, is that there's a significant drop in production. Numbers 20 to 25% are freely mentioned in certain areas. Now, not many people have a good overview, so I get reports and people talk about their own area, but they're all really saying pretty much the same thing right now. In the western part of the country, which is a larger production area as a whole, we're seeing much better situation. We're seeing in some areas, I think Amit mentioned it to us last time, there are drops in some areas and there are increases in other areas, and there is some new production coming online, which is most interesting because it is some time that we've seen that kind of increase in production in India. So let's figure out what it means if we can. So if it were 25% lower in the eastern states, that would be about a 7.5% drop overall in production. If there were a good crop in the west, as some people say, that would make it 5%, and that would be a 3.5% increase. I think 5% is probably a bit optimistic, but based on what we're hearing, I don't think that some of the numbers thrown around, like a 25% drop in production over the country, really have any sense in them. I really think that there's probably a lot of traders with RCN to sell, spreading rumors around, and it really has that kind of a feel to it right now. Time will tell. They could be right, but at the same time, it doesn't look likely that the crop will be down by those kind of numbers. But I think it's fairly certain to say that overall the Indian crop is under pressure, and time will tell. Particularly timing of the monsoon. An early monsoon will bring operations to an early end. Looking at the position of India and what does this mean in the world? Well, you can see that India produces about 15% of the world's cashews and imports about 22% of the total production. So a fall in the domestic crop, whilst significant, doesn't really have a huge impact on the overall supply and demand. But what it does do, it has a significant impact on market sentiment, it has a significant impact on processors' cash flow. It has a significant impact on how and when and where processors buy their raw cashew nuts. And it has a significant impact on how traders behave and how strong they feel. Now, Indian processors are in a slightly different situation, more than slightly actually, to Vietnamese. So a lot of major Vietnamese processors will have forward sales at the beginning of the year. And as we've discussed, a lot of those forward sales will be at low prices. That's where the market's been for a long time now. India is a different situation. Yes, certainly processors have commitments to their customers, but they don't have forward contracts. So they can, to a certain extent, adjust possibly take their time and try to see how the market will evolve. Now, they do have time constraints because the peak usage season in India is the Diwali festival. And normally in the lead up to that, you would see good demand. If there's a shortage, higher prices. But we don't have the contractual issues. So processors in India may have to deal with RCN exporters and traders who want to up the prices, but they won't be squeezed by forward contracts. It doesn't mean it's good news for them, it's not. It will make life difficult, but it won't be leading to the kind of difficulties that we might see in Vietnam as a result of defaults of RCN contracts. Let's move on. If we look at West Africa, and we quickly go through, not much change in Nigeria. Crop estimates are all over the place, 300 to 450,000 tonnes. Crop is basically finished now. It looks like it was a good one. I've heard numbers of 120,000 tonnes exported already. I've also heard 200,000 tonnes exported already. We're looking into that. We hear reports from reliable sources that about 50,000 tonnes has been procured by processors. Farm gate prices are strong. That reflects the end of the season. Quality's going down. There's also, by the way, significant flow from Benin into Nigeria this year due to the export ban there. Moving on to Ghana. I was in Ghana last week. I had a really interesting visit working with the Tree Crop Development Authority, an organization that's really maturing. Production estimates in Ghana are about 30% down, most people are saying. There is, interestingly, and I saw it last week, some late flowering. That may have a small impact to boost production, but it does look like production was severely affected in Ghana this year. Large volumes are coming across the borders in the cross-border trade. And farm gate prices, well, there's not much left. So farm gate prices have peaked up as high as 12 cedis. I was chatting to a farmer last week who told me he'd sold at 12 cedis. This is the biggest price for some time and around near enough the top of the season prices, but it's pretty much past there. Cote d'Ivoire, well, 1 million tons, 1.1 million tons, maybe a little bit more. What is interesting is that farm gate prices haven't moved since the lifting of the ban. It's been around 300 to 325 for some time. Maybe it did hit 350 at one moment, but there it stands. That's around 510. Now, quality is lower. Quality is always lower at this time of year, but the quality now is a little bit lower than you'd normally expect. 38 to 44 pounds is widely mentioned. And that is a little bit lower than you'd hope for at this time of year. Maybe 3-4 pounds lower than you'd hope for at this time of year. Benin crop pretty much over. The estimates I'm hearing, again, wide range, 140 to 180,000 tons. My guess is toward the lower end of that. Exports still not permitted officially, but there is heavy cross-border trade into the neighboring countries. And it's acting as a kind of a safety valve, I suppose, for farmers. It's kept farm gate prices high this year. It's meant that processors really don't get the dividend of the export ban to the extent that they'd hoped. This needs to be resolved. There needs to be some work done there on the mechanisms to manage the sector. Burkina Faso looks like production is well down. I think we already knew that. RCN supply is pretty limited. Now, coming to the more recent, more current harvests in Guinea-Bissau, John told us last time that the 100,000 tons had come to the port. That's obviously a lot more than that now. The cross-border trade, which was big last year, which was cross-border trade into Senegal through Ziguinchor, which is in southern Senegal, that has been largely reduced. Farm gate prices are, well, all I can say is, wow, farm gate prices now are through the roof. In recent weeks, this is I suppose it's reflecting the fact that having seen rising prices, that farmers are encouraged to hold on to their cashew nuts to see if it'll get any more. They're also supplying, together with Senegal, the only countries really supplying the top quality 50 plus, 52 plus quality RCN at the moment. And that's keeping prices pretty strong. And in Senegal, it's having an interesting impact. So last year, from Senegal, we saw huge trade, something between 85 and 100,000 tons of RCN moved from Guinea-Bissau into Senegal and was trucked up to Dakar for export. That doubled the number of traders that came to the country this year, or at least doubled the number of traders that came and set up shop in Ziguinchor. And of course, now that flow has been stemmed by the activity of the government in Bissau. So now you've got all these traders chasing much less product, and you know what happens? Prices spiral upwards. And you've got this unusual situation of too many traders following too little product, a kind of a demand-driven inflation. So that's an unrealistic situation. Again, farm gate prices are high, so it's likely that the raw cashew nuts offered for export from Guinea-Bissau and Senegal will remain at high prices, given the quality, given the local circumstances, given the farm gate situation. Crop-wise, people have been saying that the Guinea-Bissau crop will be down. People are talking at worst 10%. I'm not sure about that, but let's take that as the number for now. So that would give a crop of something like 265,000 tons, pretty decent crop. And more of that will export through the port of Bissau, from where the freight charges are much higher. And that too is impacting the costs for exporters and keeping prices for RCN from Guinea-Bissau quite high. So what does all of that mean, in our view, for the crop situation in 2024? So based on 31st of May estimates, we still think that the margin at the high end, the optimistic, the crop will be down about 5% worldwide, and at the pessimistic end, about 11% down. Now, what's changed those figures? Well, we're only talking here now in terms of volume. We haven't not built, it's no quality or yield or outturn built into this. But if we look at factors that have increased the estimates, a better crop than expected in Cambodia, more volume coming in Cote d'Ivoire, more volume from Nigeria. On the debit side of the ledger, what has caused the estimates to drop? Well, more caution on the estimates for the Indian crop. Certainly Benin, we're now thinking the lower end of the range. Ghana, the same thing, and Burkina Faso again. So those four countries, we've amended our thoughts downwards in terms of the size of the crop, whereas in these three major producers, we've increased our estimates. What could change the situation? Well, it's mostly about India right now. How good or how bad will the crop be in India? Will it be the kind of 10 to 15% down that some people are mentioning? Or will it be a little bit better than that due to some new plantations and some better yields in the western part of the country? Second factor is that we could get a longer crop in West Africa. So it could drift on. I mentioned Ghana, I mentioned Cote d'Ivoire. That can happen in a lot of countries. And, you know, this is beginning to look more and more like 2022. The only difference being that the starting prices were lower. So in 2022, we got the situation where good demand stopped mid-year or slowed mid-year. Production looked questionable, a long season. By the end of the season, crops looked much better than they did at the beginning. And we got this, in the end, not a bad crop at all. I mean, if you look, the crop in 2022 was a little bit higher than the low end of our estimates for 2024. So we're getting the feeling that maybe this is where we'll end up this year. So that's production. Let's have a look and ask the question that, this is a fascinating question for me. So can the current price levels be maintained? So first of all, what are the current price levels? So I'm thinking 330 for 320s FOB as a starting point. And let's see where that is. Let's just try and reflect on what that means over the last 5 years. On this chart, we're back to 2019. So again, we're on or about the 5-year highs. There's been 3 big spikes over that period, and they're all around 335, 345. And we're now going to call it 330. Might even be a little bit lower today. Look at our 2-year average, obviously way lower, and our 5-year average, well below the mark. I think that's $2.88 is the 5-year average. That's taking monthly FOB prices from the lowest price origin and just averaging them out over the period. So we are today well above the 5-year average, and we have been well below it for a very long period. So let's go back and have a look and see this period. So we're talking about 2021 into early 2022. In this period, we had very strong demand and disrupted supply. Why was supply disrupted? Doubts about the ability to harvest during COVID. Mostly those proved to be unfounded, and the actual harvest in those years was pretty good. More recently, we've had this period of strong demand, strong supply. And that led to low prices, something of a surprising low prices, let's say. We're about 15% below the 5-year average. So looking at this situation, you would have to conclude 15% above the 5-year average right now, 15% above the 5-year average, strong demand up to this point over a period of low prices, maximum in our calculation about 11% drop in production. You would have to come to the conclusion that there will be a reaction to higher prices, and they would be, at least at 330, difficult to maintain over the coming 6 months. There's no doubt that this level of prices, these 250, 240, this period, prices were without a doubt too low, and they've moved up partly on the supply, but that was the catalyst. Prices were always going to move off these levels. It was only a case of when. So just looking at the level of prices, you'd have to conclude, first of all, yeah, it is going to be difficult to maintain these prices. Secondly, key thing, can processing work at the current RCN prices? So again, we look at the calculation. So what I do is I take the cost of the RCN on a cost and freight basis and try and convert it into a W320 FOB price, and particularly at the moment taking into account quality. So if we take Cote d'Ivoire, £44, Vietnam, that'll give you a cost of 325. Doesn't look as if it is going to be workable in a market at 330. In India, I took Guinea-Bissau, £52. Again, it is below the market, but it's not sufficiently below the market to give a sufficient margin for processors to find that attractive. The only one that works is origin-based processing. So if you take Cote d'Ivoire, £44, and you have I think I take a processing cost. You can see it here on the right-hand side of the slide. For African RCN in Vietnam, I use $200. For West African large factories, that's mostly in Cote d'Ivoire, but also in Nigeria, I use about $450 a ton. What is that? That is the cost per ton of raw cashew nuts to process. On that basis, 14.50 for Cote d'Ivoire and 17.50 for Guinea-Bissau would be too high to make sense in the current kernels market. So we can conclude either raw cashew nut prices are too high or cashew kernel prices are too low. Now, the previous slide, when we looked at the level of prices, told us that cashew kernels prices were unlikely to be maintained any higher for the second half of the year. So that would push it towards the RCN. But there is one thing we should say, 14.50 for 44 pounds, that means probably going to Vietnam. Guinea-Bissau at much higher price, 17.50, I've mentioned, I've seen 1800 even as an offered price for 52 pounds. That to India might be more workable than 14.50 Cote d'Ivoire into Vietnam. Now these are new sales. If we were to take existing contracts, assuming they're shipped, the picture looks very different. So on any existing contract that's executed, on any RCN that's been purchased, processors look pretty good, especially the origin-based processors. So what Vietnamese processors have bought in Cambodia or Vietnam, what Indian processors buy in India, or Ivorian processors or Nigerian processors in their own countries, that material already bought looks pretty good, and it's obviously very workable. So this could be a good year for African processors if they've bought. That's processing and prices. The supply-demand balance is obviously a huge factor in maintaining the level of pricing over the period. And as you can see, so here you have in blue consumption or demand, and in green you have production. Sometimes consumption exceeds demand because we have carry-in stocks from year to year. But in the last 4 years, the last 3 years certainly, we've had a surplus. We've had a surplus of production. It hasn't always made it to the markets, but we have had a surplus. So I took scenario one and I said that let's say the higher prices have no impact on demand and the demand continues to grow at the 5-year average, which is 4-point-something% worldwide. Production, the best estimate that we've got, that's the one I've shown you. We take an average yield of 22% net. So that's your cutting test, less your process losses. That would leave us in a scenario where we have a small deficit. In other words, demand would be slightly better than supply. More likely is scenario 2. In scenario 2, we have a situation where higher prices have an impact on demand, which I'll talk to you about a little bit more on the next slide. Secondly, that means there's no demand growth. Doesn't mean demand drops away, just no growth. Same as last year. Last year was a great year, by the way. That would lead us to a small surplus, as you can see there. Now, one of the key things about cashews is that there is a harvest almost every month. Well, there is a harvest every month of the year. The volume varies, of course, but there will be, after the West African harvest cycle comes towards an end or heads towards an end, the next new crop cycle starts again in, you could even say probably July in Indonesia, but certainly July, August, Indonesia, followed by Tanzania from late September, followed by Brazil into late October and November. That will add about 475,000 tons. That's additional. That's new crop. That's the next crop, the way we work it. So the 1.1 million tons Cote d'Ivoire, the 4.5 million tons worldwide, you add that into it from probably available to the market beginning in October for processing November, and that kicks in. So this is the, so from an Indian perspective, for example, this would start to impact supply post Diwali. So get through to Diwali and then start to look at the Southern Hemisphere harvest. Might be a strategy from the Indian point of view. So the supply-demand balance is not looking, with or without an impact of high prices, it's not looking particularly unbalanced at the moment. let's have a look at demand and let's think about how might demand react to higher prices. And our best guide is to look at what happened in the past. So here you've got a chart, and the red dotted line is the price of 320's FOB. And the black solid line is year to year, the change in consumption or demand. So from 2010 to 2011, demand dropped by 1.97%. From 11 to 12, it increased by 9.53%. And what we see is quite volatile, and it's more volatile in recent years. So in this period, price stability, even at relatively high prices, at no point in that period were prices below $3.25 a pound FOB, demand grew quite strongly. So it grew at 9.5, even almost 16%, then settled down a bit and continued. So in a period of price stability, demand grew quickly, even at relatively high prices. Then we look at what happened in a period of volatility. So as we all know, 2017, we saw highest average monthly price was 476. The actual highest price was 525, but the prices were high. The market was volatile from 2016, late 15 into 2018 into early 19. And demand, due to high prices and due to volatile trading conditions, demand growth just stopped. There is a little bit of a time lag. So you see the high prices of 2017 more or less impacted demand in 2018. And it's interesting looking at this that there is a time lag when prices fall, but there's less of a time lag when prices rise. So what we're saying is that demand and buyers react more quickly to rises in price than they do to falls in price. Now, the overall situation is quite positive. Demand has grown in 12 of the last 14 years, but it's the speed of that growth that's impacted. When we look at recent years, we see, I'm going to just call it the COVID anomaly. 2020, big fall in demand. 2021, a big rise in demand. It was COVID. We know about lockdowns and consumption and markets closing and opening up and so on. 2022 was something different. The economic conditions impacted demand. This was primarily in Western markets, Europe and North America. Inflation, energy costs, uncertainty. It was a little bit like going back to the financial crisis when we saw demand slump. So the growth in demand during that period has basically slowed down completely. A little bit of demand in Asia, contraction in the United States, flat in Europe, a little bit of growth in India. That was followed in 2023 by strong growth. So we're back in business, 8% up demand last year. US was up, Europe was up, basically everywhere was up. Notably was China. Now, what we have seen also is in countries with dominant supermarket chains, low prices may not have been passed on. So one of the reasons why we don't get a response, because you might say, well, why aren't we getting more response to low prices, is simply because those aren't passed on. So that dilutes the impact of lower prices. So looking at this pattern, so we've seen quite a volatile pattern in recent years, -1%, +9.5%, +1%, +8%. But this kind of on-off pattern would seem to suggest that demand may slow fairly quickly in the second half of 2024. We are beginning to see a few small signs of that. Now, the other thing we should bear in mind that statistically, current prices, they actually don't look that high. We've looked at where periods where there were similar prices, long periods where the market was way over $3 without really impacting demand. But don't forget, for many buyers, particularly at the supermarket end, at the importer end of the market, they might be recent entrants to the market. So for many buyers, these current prices will look very high because they're used to 240, 250, 255 as a price for 320s. Now they're seeing 330, 340, and they think that's, wow, that's to more experienced campaigners, that might be their equivalent of $4 a pound. That needs to be borne in mind too. And there are a couple of interesting factors about certain markets. So here you've got the same chart again. You've got the world growth and demand, and I've added in North America in red and Asia, excluding India. So this includes China, Japan, Malaysia, Korea, all those other countries. But it doesn't have India in there because India is a market unto itself. And so you can see that the growth of the US market and Canadian market in red, up and down year by year, and the growth in Asia up and down in green. And what we can say is that the US market has been more volatile than the world market on average in the last 4 years. We can also say that Asian markets, they've been more volatile, but they have responded to lower prices more than the average, especially in 2023. So when prices went down in 2023, we saw big reaction. China's imports increased, imports into countries of the Middle East or East Asia, West Asia increased pretty dramatically. So these two markets, China and the US, may be the markets that give us the first indications and the first guide to the impact of higher prices. What about contract defaults? So, by the way, one thing about defaults I wanted to highlight is when you tear up a contract, you tear up a relationship with the buyer as well. And there are also residual defaults from when prices were falling. So there's disputes that are still ongoing from when prices were falling and buyers decided to delay, not to ship. And there's going to be certainly a little bit of tit for tat in this. But what's the reaction to defaults? Well, your first signal is your shipment's delayed. And what do? You negotiate. Whilst you're negotiating, decision-making becomes slower. You don't tend to do too much while you're negotiating an existing contract to try and sort out the problems. I know this from personal experience. Second, you decide to take action. So you need product. Do you need replacement? Well, you have two choices. You could use less, so you don't need as much replacement, or you could buy more. So you end up buying back the cargo that's been defaulted on just from somebody else. The impact of that is more demand now, but less demand later. Now, put that in the context of, we've seen this huge activity in the market, we've seen this spike in prices, and then add in 2025, the possibility of another good crop, maybe a huge crop in Cambodia, maybe a huge crop in Cote d'Ivoire too. And what would the impact of less demand later be? Bear in mind, we're trying to answer the question, can these current price levels be maintained? Reaction. Well, someone defaults, what do? You try to find a new supplier. Or you stop buying cashews and you look for alternative nuts. And with INC predicting world production of tree nuts this year up by 8%, there's plenty of alternative nuts out there. I think they're looking at almonds with double-digit growth in production, for example. So defaults will cause reaction in the short term, which I'm just calling more demand now. And in the long term, less demand later. Maybe a benefit for new suppliers. If you're an African processor with good food safety, good marketing, you might be reaping the benefits of this current situation. But it will also lead people, as it did in 2017 and 2018, when a lot of new product launches were shut down because of price volatility, it could also lead to a move toward alternative prices. And I think we need to guard against that by trying somehow to ensure that this current volatility in the market settles down as soon as possible. What might all of this mean for the 2025 season? Well, when you look at it, if you were to make a scenario 2025, good crops everywhere, normal crops everywhere, but plus this additional production coming online, not much impact on demand, but taking some impact on demand. Growth slows down. The demand stops growing at 4.6%. It just shuts down to zero as a scenario. This is what we end up with. We end up with a significant surplus. In fact, we end up with the second largest surplus in history. The largest was 2021, but I'm not sure that 2021 is correct. I still have doubts about that. Crop reported 1.1 million tons in Cambodia in 2021. Nonetheless, the second largest surplus in history we would have, that'd be lower farm gate prices, reduced forward buying, and reduced promotions. So that this kind of volatility, such sharp rises and falls in a very tight period, can have really difficult long-term impacts. What can we learn from this? Well, we need better market information, especially at national level and at processor level, to understand buyers of raw cashew nuts in Vietnam need to have access to better market opportunity and information that can allow them to judge the situation. Secondly, the change from low price, low quality to high price, value addition takes time, and it's not going to be without troubles, as we've seen. And this change is essentially what's going on. To a certain extent in Vietnam, the change toward more value-added products, and it is the right way to go in my opinion. And on the other hand, the change from low price RCN exports in Africa to higher price value-added products. The market is going to take time to adjust to this. It will become more unpredictable, and there are plenty of opportunists there to take advantage of the situation. Thirdly, again related to point number 2, that policy making and regulation without information or market understanding will have unintended consequences. And this year, we've seen unintended consequences of huge illegal cross-border trade in West Africa. We have seen impacts on farmers, and we've seen impacts on processors that were never intended through the regulatory or policies that were introduced. Policymakers just don't have the information to make good decisions. Contract enforcement mechanisms are essential. It is, again, every time there's volatility in the industry, it is a threat. And we wonder why processors come and go, why buyers come and go, why people switch from cashews to almonds or other nuts. The answer is really here. The answer is in the risks involved. The answer is in how do we ensure that contracts are enforceable? Right now, we don't, is the bottom line. You can threaten, if you want to take a case against someone on a shipment of raw cashew nuts, it's hardly worth the money because it takes so long and it takes so much resources. And the final conclusion, which for me is really a result of many of the other factors, that the business culture in our industry now, the culture of speculation, of rumor, and what I apply, everyone knows what the zero-sum game is, but what I apply to the cashew business is this idea of the zero-sum game. I win, you lose, that is destructive. And this culture is destructive to the industry. It's not throughout. There are plenty of examples where it doesn't exist, but it is causing volatility and it is contributing to all of these other factors. The culture means information is less valued and less transparent. It means it's more difficult to change the way of doing business. It's more difficult to make policies, and it's impossible to enforce contracts. There's a lot of things we can learn from this, and this has happened in a short period of time. It probably, hopefully, will settle down. At whatever price it finds, it probably will settle down, but it is likely to have a long-term impact into 2025. So some key points for you from today's session. The current market is off the highs. Raw cashew nut prices have not yet reacted. They still are in or about the highs. We may see that change shortly. Production in 2024, in my opinion, is not as bad as was rumoured or is rumoured in some quarters, but Indian production is still a concern. We are getting the beginnings of some demand reaction to the higher prices. Disbelief is the main reaction, but there are other reactions, both constructive and destructive. Expect more of that in the coming weeks. Contract default could reverse the positive moves in demand. So we need demand for cashew nuts to grow because production is growing. We want this industry to thrive. The risk created by contract infidelity and default could reverse that progress. And without any real, let's be very frank, without any real global, even national marketing of cashews yet, the bad news fills the space which should be filled with the good news of professional marketing and branding. And finally, my opinion, not the ACA's opinion, but mine, that the market culture and information systems right now are not fit for purpose. So thanks for listening this morning. Let me pass you back to Ernest and let me hear the questions and see how much trouble I've gotten myself into today.
Thank you so much, Jim. You're not in any trouble. And thanks so much also to our audience. Now, please, if you have any question, you can raise your hand or just drop it in the chat or Q&A box. But I have two questions for you, Jim, and they have to do, first of all, with the 14% loss, which you are envisaging as a result of the quality issues. You mentioned West Africa, you touched on the IBC particularly. Then the question then is more, does this loss get compensated by the growth in production in Cambodia, as you have shown us?
Well, the actual volume loss, of course, does get compensated by the growth in Cambodia. But we have to consider, so Cambodian raw cashew nuts are large raw cashew nuts. They're very suitable. I mean, they're fabulous quality. They're very suitable for specific markets. So whereas that quality might be compensated to a certain extent in markets like China and the Middle East, where those nuts may end up, or in the market for the unpeeled kernels, it's unlikely to be compensated in markets in the West, where you're looking for, where the trend has developed that we're looking for a basic AFI spec 320. So I don't think it is going to be fully compensated. Obviously tonnage it is, but in terms of yield of 320s, probably not.
In the second and last question here has to do with Benin. I think earlier in the year you had made an estimate of about 10,000 being the stock so far by processors. Now that, as you reported, the season is over in Benin, what has been your estimate of the stock position for processors in Benin?
I think processors in Benin have not bought as much as they would have liked to have bought. I haven't spoken to them to get an idea of what exactly has been bought, but I think they may be a little bit disappointed. I won't go into any numbers, but I will check it out and I'll talk to you about that next time. Very good.
So on this point, what do you think are the talking points for the coming weeks? Oh, before you move on to the talking points, I have Amit Pai, who is asking, are we heading to a similar situation as 2022, skyrocketing Bizarre and then Skyfall 1625 to 1275, and how different is the crop situation this year? So you may want to take Amit price, yeah.
I think the crop situation, Amit, is probably a little bit lower, a little bit worse this year than it was then, but not by much. The quality is definitely worse than it was then. I actually think that high quality raw nuts will maintain their value because they're high quality. And that what will happen is that the gap between lower quality material and higher quality material will widen. So my guess is that low quality, the 44, 45 pound material will slump a little bit in price because it is overpriced. Probably high quality material, 52 plus, will maintain its value, and it probably is a little bit overpriced right now, but there are cost factors there too, keeping those prices high, much higher freight, much higher farm gate prices, higher export taxes. So bearing in mind the cost factors, I think the high quality material is much more likely to maintain its price at these high levels. Although it is pretty difficult to work through some of the prices. But if you look at it now, if you take Bissau material to India, it's tight, but it may work. But if you took Bissau material at these prices to Vietnam for processing and re-export to Europe or the US, well, that isn't going to work. So I think we might see a little bit more direction of product to particular markets. It is a bit like 2022, but I don't expect the correction in price to be as dramatic on RCN as it was, but I do expect there to be a correction.
Yeah. Okay. So now let me read the other one. Hi, Jim. Very insightful information on cashew trends and progress. El Nino had negative impacts as rain came and went off within short time. This may also impact production in all areas that were impacted by El Nino. What is your take?
Yeah, well, we've definitely seen there's been an impact in Cambodia in certain areas, but that certainly in Vietnam and Cambodia in certain areas, but that the increased plantings that came online seem to have compensated that in Cambodia to a large extent. That, of course, is a signal of a big crop next year in normal weather conditions. It seems, as the situation evolves, that there has been an impact in India. Now, it might be, from what people are saying, more in the eastern states than in the western states, but there has been an impact there. So certainly El Nino has had an impact. In West Africa too, but it's a little bit, seems to be a little bit different in West Africa. If we look at Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, the more northern parts of the country have been more impacted. Certainly Ghana has had an impact on its crop. Cote d'Ivoire seems to have had less of an impact on volume and more of an impact on the quality of the material. So I don't think that I think we have to look closely. We can't make big generalizations, but has El Nino had an impact? Yes, for sure. And that is the reason why we've seen lower crops. Now there is the phenomenon that follows the La Nina, and although that hasn't historically had a huge impact on cashews, that's something that we need to watch for the coming 12 months.
Very good. Jim, now I'll allow you to move on to what the talking points in your view will be in the coming 2 weeks.
Well, this is how I'm seeing it over the coming 2 weeks. Not a great deal of change, more the issues we've been talking about. Crop progress in India, well, everyone needs to keep a close eye on that. If it were as bad as some of the rumors say, it changes everything. Don't think it is, keep an eye. How will kernel's demand respond to prices? I think that we need to watch markets which are likely to react quickly. So the markets in the Middle East, markets in China, and now there's an element of seasonal slowing there as well, but we need still to have a look. But also the US, which seems to be the same market that's quite price sensitive, more so than perhaps the European market. Keep an eye on RCN shipments. How much is being shipped? What price is being sold? Are we going to see a price correction? What's going to happen on contracts and defaults? Will there be major defaults? Will processors be able to meet their commitments? Negotiate? How will that work out? And the final thing, and I think that we should also bear in mind, as supporters of the African processing industry, that in the coming couple of weeks, you might see much more interest in engaging with West African cashew processors from buyers, particularly Europeans and Americans, where the market's a little bit more logical in terms of location. In West Africa in the coming weeks, but as we get into September, people will also look in East Africa. Maybe we see Mozambique, a resurgence in cashew processing there, and further developments in Tanzania. That's going to be really interesting too. So again, I don't think the next 2 weeks are as volatile an outlook as the last 2 weeks. But this, as they say, this thing needs to be watched. And don't forget the cashew conference. Keep an eye on that too over the next 2 weeks, and you could register. And I'll see you in Benin, and we'll talk cashews there face to face. So thanks for joining us. Thank you, Ernest. Thanks to your staff, interpreters, and so on. And most of all, thanks to everyone who joined us today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. And your attendance at these events is much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Jim, once again. And thanks to the audience. And see you again on the 3rd of July when we come your way with the next edition of the Global Markets Encounter. Take care and bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. I thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is Zan I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use science that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. I thank you, GIZ, Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is Zan I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use science that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with science, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting.
This is an experience worth taking back home. I can't forget this. My farming group need to experience it too. I can't do it all alone. I thank you, GIZ, Com Cashew, ACA, all of this. Look at it. This is land I've just harvested for grafting. It's a true practical. Agriculture is practical. And if we must truly take care of food security, we must go practical. Enough of theory. This is it.
And I use these skills on training my colleagues at the nursery. We now use science that we prepare in the same day, and we graft. We graft millions of cashew seedlings per year, and some of those seedlings are grafted with science, prepared and collected in the same day. This is a good achievement for us, because we use it to prepare 7 days before. So we have an impact in reducing the time of grafting.